The suffocation began with the light. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped a relentless, glittering brilliance onto the sea of curated smiles below. In the grand ballroom of the Philadelphia Heritage Museum, wealth wasn't just displayed, it was weaponized. It was in the clinking of champagne flutes that cost more than a month's rent, in the murmur of conversations that could shift markets, and, in the very scent of the air, a heavy perfume of money, ambition, and expensive floral arrangements. This was Judge Vanessa Rhodes's world, though she never felt entirely of it. She navigated its currents with the same calm precision she applied to her courtroom, her smile a polite, impenetrable shield. Tonight, she was the guest of honor, the recipient of the Philadelphia Civic Heart Award for her work in establishing a legal aid program for underprivileged youth. The irony was as thick as the velvet ropes corralling the press. Here she was, celebrated by the very class of people whose predatory business practices often created the need for such programs in the first place. She wore a simple, elegant navy gown, a stark column of color in a room awash with sequins and silk. Her hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, emphasizing the strong lines of her jaw and the intelligent, watchful calm in her dark eyes. At 46, Vanessa had cultivated an aura of untouchable authority, a stillness that made others lean in, that forced them to quiet their own bluster in her presence. "You look magnificent, Judge." The voice, smooth as aged whiskey, slid into her ear. She didn't need to turn. She knew the sound, the faint, cloying scent of his cologne, Julian Croft. She turned slowly, her polite smile firmly in place. "Julian, thank you. You're looking prosperous, as always." He was the city's golden titan, a real estate mogul who didn't just build skyscrapers, but seemed to rearrange the very skyline at will. His photograph was a fixture in society pages and business journals, a mane of silvering hair, a tan that spoke of weekend trips to the Caribbean, and eyes the color of a stormy sea that held a perpetual, predatory gleam. He was charismatic, powerful, and a major benefactor to the police union, a fact that gave him an entirely different kind of influence in the city. "Prosperity is a byproduct of vision," he said, his smile a masterpiece of practiced charm. "Something I've always said you have in spades." Vanessa. From the bench. "Of course." He gestured toward the stage, where the master of ceremonies was beginning his introduction. "They're about to sing your praises. Don't let it go to your head." "I rarely let anything," she replied, her tone cool and even. They had history, a tangled, unspoken thing that stretched back decades to a neighborhood long since erased by gentrification, a place of row houses and chain-link fences that existed now only in memory. They orbited each other at these events, their conversations a carefully choreographed dance of pleasantries layered over a bedrock of something cold and hard. He watched her with an intensity that always felt like more than just social observation. It felt like a measurement. The mayor finished his glowing introduction, and a wave of polite, sustained applause carried Vanessa to the stage. She stepped up to the podium, the crystal award a cold, heavy weight in her hands. The lights were hot, the faces a blur of glittering jewelry and indistinct smiles. "Thank you, Mayor Ashton," she began, her voice calm and clear, filling the vast room without effort. "Thank you to the Civic Heart Committee. It's an honor to be recognized. But the true honor belongs to the dedicated attorneys and volunteers who give their time." She spoke of justice, of equity, of the responsibility of the powerful to protect the vulnerable. Her words were measured, powerful, and sincere. The room was rapt. This was her element. In the courtroom or at a podium, her authority was absolute. As she was about to deliver her closing remarks, a movement at the side of the stage caught her eye. Julian Croft was walking calmly toward the podium, a benign smile on his face. The audience murmured, confused. He reached the stage and, instead of waiting for her to finish, he gently placed a hand on her arm. "Forgive me, Vanessa," he said, his voice amplified by the microphone she'd just been using. He sounded warm, avuncular. "I hope you'll all indulge me for just a moment. As a longtime friend of the Rodas family, I feel a personal pride in seeing her here tonight." Vanessa stood frozen, a statue of composure. But inside, a cold dread began to unspool. This was not part of the program. He leaned closer to the microphone, his friendly mask perfectly in place. "Vanessa speaks so eloquently of moral authority," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the audience before settling back on her. "And she is a testament to the fact that one can overcome anything, even the shadows of a difficult past." The air in the room shifted. The polite smiles tightened. This was no longer a tribute. It was something else entirely. "Some of you may not know," Julian went on, his tone now laced with a subtle, theatrical pity. "But Vanessa's strength was forged in tragedy. A terrible fire. When we were just teenagers. A fire that destroyed her family's home in the old Elmwood district." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. A fire that took a life. Vanessa's blood ran cold. The fire. The one subject she never, ever spoke of. The memory, usually a locked box in the deepest recess of her mind, flew open. The smell of smoke. The orange glow against her bedroom wallpaper. The splintering crack of burning wood. The screams. Her father's face, soot-stained and desperate. And another face. A girl's, lost in the chaos. It was a youthful indiscretion. "Of course," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone carried to every corner of the ballroom. "A forgotten candle. A moment of carelessness. But it's a heavy burden for a young person to carry. To know that a simple mistake can have such devastating consequences." He turned to her, his eyes boring into hers. "It's a testament to your character, Vanessa, that you've built such a life for yourself, a life dedicated to judging the mistakes of others. When you carry the weight of such a profound one yourself." He took the microphone from the stand and handed it back to her, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was cold. "Congratulations, Judge." He walked off the stage to a stunned, uncertain silence. He hadn't accused her of a crime. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had, with surgical precision, taken her most private grief and twisted it into a public question of her moral fitness. He had weaponized her trauma under the guise of a compliment. The shock in the room was palpable. Hundreds of eyes were on her, no longer seeing the honored judge, but a woman with a hidden, shameful secret. They were seeing the narrative he had just crafted for them. Vanessa stood at the podium, the microphone cold in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But on the outside, she was ice. She raised the microphone to her lips, her gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces. She did not look at Julian Croft. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice impossibly steady, devoid of any emotion. "For that unexpected trip down memory lane." She placed the microphone back on its stand with a soft, definitive click. She looked at the award in her hands, then back at the audience. "As I was saying, the work is what matters. Thank you." She walked off the stage, not back to her table, but straight toward the grand exit, her back ramrod straight, her steps measured and deliberate. The applause that followed was hesitant, confused, a smattering of sound in a room thick with scandal. She didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The suffocating opulence of the ballroom giving way to the stark, empty quiet of the museum's marble plaza. Only then, alone in the shadows, did she allow her hands to tremble. The fight hadn't just been brought to her. It had been declared in front of the entire city. And it was about something far deeper and more dangerous than a legal dispute. It was about the ashes of the past, and a fire that had never truly gone out. The sterile tension of the United States Courthouse for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania was a world away from the cloying atmosphere of the gala. Here, the air smelled of old paper, ambition, and the faint, metallic tang of justice, or, at least, its pursuit. Every polished surface, from the marble floors to the brass elevator doors, reflected a distorted, slightly predatory version of whoever passed before it. This was Vanessa's sanctuary, the one place where the rules were clear and her authority was codified. But since the gala, the familiar halls felt different. The deferential nods from attorneys seemed tinged with curiosity. The quiet greetings from her colleagues felt weighted with unspoken questions. Julian Croft's poisoned words had followed her here. Her chambers were an oasis of controlled calm. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound legal texts, their spines a testament to centuries of precedent. The only personal touch was a silver-framed photograph on her mahogany desk, a smiling man with kind eyes and a proud bearing. His arm around a teenage Vanessa, her father, Daniel Rodas, a man who had been a community leader, a church deacon, a force for good in their now-vanished Elmwood neighborhood. A man whose legacy Julian Croft had just publicly desecrated. The vultures are circling. David Chen, her law clerk, entered without knocking, a tablet in his hand and a storm cloud on his brow. David was young, brilliant, and fiercely loyal, a legal prodigy who saw Vanessa not just as a mentor, but as the embodiment of what a judge should be. Article in the Chronicle this morning. Questions of past tragedy swirl around Civic Heart honoree. They quote an anonymous source close to the family, suggesting you were never fully forthcoming about the fire. Vanessa didn't look up from the brief she was reading. Let me guess. The source also mentioned how you've dedicated your life to sitting in judgment of others, a classic psychological overcompensation. David's silence was confirmation. "How are you doing this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and concern. "If someone did that to me, I'd be, I don't know, wrecked." "Being wrecked is a luxury, David," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her own was clear, steady. "It's an indulgence our opponents count on. We don't give it to them." She took the tablet and scanned the article. It was expertly crafted, filled with insinuation rather than accusation. It quoted Julian Croft's on-stage remarks, framing them as a brave, if clumsy, attempt by a friend to acknowledge a painful past. The article was a masterclass in character assassination, disguised as sympathetic reporting. "He's not just a real estate developer," Vanessa murmured, more to herself than to David. "He's a narrative architect." "He's more than that," David countered, pulling up a new file on his tablet. "I did that deep dive you asked for. Julian Croft isn't just a benefactor to the police union. He's on their advisory board. He personally funded the lobbying effort that got their last contract approved, the one with the weaker accountability measures. He sits on the board of 3 major media conglomerates, including the parent company that owns the Chronicle, and he's the single largest private donor to Mayor Ashton's Political Action Committee." Vanessa absorbed the information, the pieces clicking into place. Croft's power wasn't a series of disconnected strongholds. It was a web, intricate and interlocking, woven through every major institution in the city: the police, the press, The politicians, he had influence over them all. "He's insulated," she said. "He's a fortress," David corrected. "And he just fired the first cannon shot at you." A knock at the door, sharper and more official this time, interrupted them. It was Judge William Harding, the chief judge of the district, a man whose political sensibilities were as finely tuned as his legal mind. "Vanessa." A word he asked, his expression carefully neutral as he closed the door behind him. He glanced at David. "It's fine. Bill, David is my clerk. He's aware of the situation." Harding sighed, sinking into one of the leather chairs opposite her desk. He looked tired. "The situation has reached my office. I've received a formal inquiry from the Judicial Conduct Board." Vanessa felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but her face remained impassive. "On what grounds?" "It's vague," Harding admitted. "Concerns regarding past events that may bear on the judge's capacity for unbiased adjudication. It doesn't mention the fire explicitly, but we all know what this is about. It's signed by a concerned citizens group." "A citizens group funded by Julian Croft, I presume," Vanessa said dryly. "Presumably," Harding agreed. "Listen, Vanessa, I know this is a smear job. You are one of the finest judges on this bench, but the optics are terrible. Croft has the media and half of City Hall in his pocket. He's framing this as a matter of public trust." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I'm not telling you what to do, but it might be prudent to lower your profile for a while. Take a leave of absence. Perhaps let this blow over." The suggestion, polite and couched in concern, felt like a betrayal. He was asking her to retreat, to cede the field to Croft. So, when a powerful man publicly attacks a sitting federal judge, the advice from the chief judge is for her to hide. Vanessa's voice was quiet, but it had an edge of steel. "The advice is to be strategic," Harding countered, his frustration showing. "This isn't a courtroom. Vanessa, you can't win this with gavels and precedent. Croft plays a different game. He's trying to drag you into the mud, and the board has to investigate. It's procedural." After Harding left, a heavy silence filled the chambers. David finally broke it. "He's asking you to surrender." "He's asking me to be a politician," Vanessa corrected, "to manage perception instead of seeking truth." She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city spread below. Croft's newest skyscraper, a gleaming monument of glass and steel, dominated the skyline. The Phoenix Tower, he called it, rising from the ashes. The name suddenly felt like a personal mockery. For years, she had compartmentalized the fire. It was a tragedy, an accident, a source of a deep, abiding grief that she carried in silence. Her father, Daniel, had been a rock, guiding her and her mother through the aftermath, focusing on rebuilding their lives, never dwelling on what they had lost. But he'd been different after that night. A light had gone out in his kind eyes, replaced by a permanent, weary sadness he tried to hide. He had died of a heart attack 5 years later, at only 52. The doctors called it a medical event, but Vanessa always believed he had died of a broken heart. Now, Croft had taken that private pain and turned it into a public spectacle. Why it couldn't just be about some old neighborhood rivalry. The scale of the attack felt disproportionate, deeply personal. This wasn't business. This was a vendetta. "David," she said, turning from the window, her decision made, "cancel my appointments for the rest of the day and get me everything you can find on the Elmwood fire of 1993. Police reports, fire marshal investigations, insurance claims, newspaper archives, everything." "You're going to fight him," David said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Julian Croft has declared war on my family's name and my professional integrity, Vanessa stated. Her voice low and resonant with a cold fury she had kept tightly leashed for days. He seems to have forgotten what I do for a living. I adjudicate. It's time to gather the evidence. The inciting incident wasn't just the humiliation. It was the realization that to defend her future, she would have to excavate the one part of her past she had sworn never to disturb. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Croft's opening salvo at the gala had been the cannon shot. Now came the precision strikes. The smear campaign began subtly, a trickle of insinuation that soon became a flood. An opinion piece appeared in the Chronicle, penned by a so-called judicial ethics expert, discussing the theoretical challenges judges face when their personal histories contain unresolved moral ambiguities. It never mentioned Vanessa's name, but it didn't have to. Next came the whispers in the hallowed halls of power. A fellow judge on a charity board casually mentioned to Vanessa over coffee, "It must be so difficult to feel safe in your line of work." Judge. So many unpredictable elements. One must be terribly careful. The man's smile was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. It was a message, delivered through a proxy. "We can reach you anywhere." The formal complaint to the Judicial Conduct Board was the first concrete obstacle. It was an official process, slow and bureaucratic, but it cast a shadow of impropriety over her. Vanessa was summoned to a preliminary hearing, a closed-door meeting in a sterile conference room that felt more like an interrogation. 3 senior judges sat opposite her, their faces grimly impartial. They asked questions about the fire, about her state of mind at the time, about whether the trauma could subconsciously influence her rulings. "With all due respect, judges," Vanessa responded, her voice a calm island in a sea of suspicion. "My personal history is a matter of record, as is my judicial history. If you can point to a single ruling in my 15 years on the bench that demonstrates bias or emotional compromise, I will recuse myself from every case on my docket. But you cannot, because one does not exist." She defended herself with cool, legal precision, but she could see it wasn't enough. The complaint wasn't designed to succeed on its merits. It was designed to exist, to force the process, to legitimize the cloud of suspicion Croft was so carefully seeding. Her superiors, including Chief Judge Harding, treated her with a new, cautious distance. They weren't hostile, but they were wary. She was no longer just Judge Rodes, a respected colleague. She was Judge Rodes, the subject of an investigation. She had become a political liability. While the institutional walls closed in around her, Vanessa and David opened a second front. Her chambers became a war room after hours, the glow of their laptops casting long shadows against the law books. They were digging, not for dirt, but for context, for the answer to the one question that consumed her. Why? "I think I found something," David said late one night. His voice hushed with excitement. He pointed to a digitized map of Philadelphia from the early 1990s on his screen. The Elmwood district was a patchwork of residential streets and small businesses. This was the neighborhood. "Here's your old street, Sycamore Lane." He zoomed in. "And here, look at this." He highlighted a larger area a few blocks away. This was the site of the old Keystone Textiles Mill. It closed in '89. The city designated it a blighted property in '91. "I remember," Vanessa said. "There was a lot of talk about what would happen to it. My father was on a community council trying to get it turned into a park and a rec center." David pulled up a series of city planning documents. The council's proposal was gaining a lot of traction, but there was a competing bid from a new, aggressive development company. They wanted to tear down the mill and the surrounding blocks to build luxury condos. The company was called Croft Properties. Vanessa stared at the screen. Julian. His first major project. David confirmed. He was young, hungry, and trying to make a name for himself. But the community, led by your father, was blocking him. They argued that luxury condos would destroy the neighborhood's character and displace longtime residents. He pulled up a scanned newspaper clipping from the Elmwood Community News. The headline read, "Daniel Rhodes's rallies neighbors against developers' vulture plan." A cold clarity began to settle over Vanessa. This wasn't a recent animosity. Its roots were deep, tangled in the soil of the neighborhood they both came from. The fire happened 2 months after that article was published. David said softly, "After the fire, the community council fell apart." Vanessa recalled, the memories returning with a painful rush. People were grieving, scared. My father. He withdrew. He didn't have the strength to lead anymore. The fight just died. And what happened to the mill, she asked, though she already knew the answer. David pulled up a new document, a signed development deal between the city of Philadelphia and Croft Properties. Dated 6 months after the fire. Croft got his condos. He said, "The fire didn't just destroy your home, Judge. It cleared his path." The implication was monstrous. A dark shape moving just beneath the surface of the facts. But it was still just a shape, without form or proof. Their investigation hit a wall when they tried to access the official records of the fire. The fire marshal's report was sealed, and the police case file was listed as archived, inaccessible. That's not normal procedure for a residential fire, even one with a fatality. David muttered, frowning at his screen. Files get archived, but inaccessible usually means there's an ongoing interest or a court seal. Why would this one be locked down so tightly? Vanessa needed another way in, a way around the official channels that were clearly compromised. She thought of the faces from the gala, the network of journalists and power brokers she interacted with, but never truly trusted. There was one exception: Maria Flores. Maria was a veteran investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a tenacious, old-school journalist who had been chasing stories of corruption in the city for 30 years. She had a reputation for being fearless and incorruptible. Maria had tried to expose Croft a decade ago, linking him to a bid-rigging scandal, but her key witness had recanted at the last minute, and the story had died. Vanessa invited her to lunch at a small, out-of-the-way Italian restaurant, far from the courthouse and its watchful eyes. Maria arrived, her trench coat collar turned up, her gaze sharp and appraising. "Judge Rhodes," she said, skipping the pleasantries as she sat down. "I was surprised to get your call. I don't usually have lunch with the subjects of front-page speculation." "That's why I called you." "Maria," Vanessa replied, "you don't follow the pack. And you're the only person I know who has gone up against Julian Croft and lived to tell the tale." Vanessa laid out what she and David had discovered: the connection between Croft's first development and the fire. The sealed records. The smear campaign. She didn't ask Maria to be a source. She asked her to be a partner. Maria listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Vanessa finished, she took a long sip of water. "I've always known there was something rotten about Croft's origin story," she said. "He came out of nowhere with that first big condo deal. Everyone wrote it off as talent and luck. But I never bought it. The Elmwood fire. I covered it briefly at the time. It was reported as a tragic accident. A candle, they said. But I remember hearing whispers. Things that never made it into print." "What kind of whispers?" Vanessa pressed. "That the official story was too neat, Maria said, that the fire burned too hot, too fast, that your family wasn't the only one devastated that night. She leaned forward, her voice low. There was another family, a few houses down. Their home was also destroyed. They lost everything, and they lost a child. A chill traced its way down Vanessa's spine. A child died. She said, I know. It was a neighborhood girl. The memory was hazy, shrouded in the smoke and panic of the night. A face, a name she couldn't quite grasp. What was her name? Vanessa asked. Maria's eyes held hers. I'd have to check my old notes. They're in storage, literal boxes of them. But I remember the family name. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. The family's name was Croft. The world tilted. The air left Vanessa's lungs. Croft. It couldn't be. Julian's family, she whispered. He had a younger sister, Maria said softly. I think her name was Sarah. Suddenly, it all made sense. The intensity of his gaze, the deeply personal nature of his attack, the decades-long obsession. This wasn't about a real estate deal. This wasn't about political power. This was about a girl named Sarah. He hadn't just witnessed the tragedy. He had lived it. And somehow, in the twisted landscape of his grief, he had laid the blame at her family's door. At that exact moment, as the terrible truth of Julian Croft's motivation dawned on her, Vanessa's phone buzzed. It was a formal email from the Judicial Conduct Board. She read the first sentence, and her blood ran cold. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties on the bench pending the outcome of a full formal investigation into your fitness to serve. Suspended. He had done it. He had stripped her of her robe, her gavel, her sanctuary. He had isolated her, removing her from the one arena where she had power. And now she knew why. This was not a war he had just started. It was the final battle in a war he had been fighting, silently and patiently, for 30 years, and he believed he was about to win. The suspension was a public execution of her career. The news broke within the hour, framed by Croft's media allies as a necessary step to preserve the integrity of the judiciary. Overnight, Vanessa went from being a respected federal judge to a pariah. Colleagues who had once sought her counsel now avoided her gaze in the courthouse halls as she packed her chambers under the watchful eye of a federal marshal. The suspension didn't just strip her of her title. It stripped her of her armor. Without the institutional protection of the bench, she was no longer Judge Rodes. She was Vanessa Rodes, private citizen, a target in the open. The world shrank to her townhouse, the quiet streets of her neighborhood now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The suspension, coupled with the revelation of Sarah Croft's death, was the midpoint of the war. The moment the true stakes were revealed, Julian's vendetta was no longer a theory. It was a terrifying certainty. His entire life, his relentless acquisition of wealth and influence had been a long, patient forging of the weapons he would one day use to destroy her and her father's legacy. He believed Daniel Rhodes, the respected community leader, was responsible for the fire that had killed his sister. It doesn't make sense, Vanessa said, pacing the length of her living room while David and Maria watched from the sofa. The room was now their de facto headquarters, covered in files, maps, and printouts. My father would never have. He organized the neighborhood watch. He petitioned the city for a new fire hydrant on our street a year before the fire. He was obsessed with safety. Grief doesn't need to make sense, Maria said, her reporter's cynicism softened by a hint of compassion. A grieving boy needed someone to blame. Your father was the public face of the opposition to Croft's project. It's a simple, hateful calculus. Croft, now certain of his advantage, escalated his attacks. The second major obstacle was no longer institutional. It was personal and suffocating. A series of anonymous, frivolous lawsuits were filed against her, alleging everything from financial misconduct in her past pro bono work to personal negligence. They were baseless, designed not to win, but to drain her resources and mire her in legal battles. Her savings, carefully accumulated over a lifetime, began to hemorrhage into legal fees. He was trying to bankrupt her. Next, he went after her allies. David was approached by a headhunter for a top corporate law firm, one that happened to be a subsidiary of a Croft-owned company. The offer was staggering, a salary triple what he could ever hope to make in public service. A corner office, a clear path to partnership. "It's a bribe, obviously," David said, showing Vanessa the offer letter with a look of disgust. "A golden cage. They want to buy my loyalty, get me away from you." "You should consider it." "David," Vanessa said, her voice heavy. "This fight, it's going to get uglier. I can't ask you to sacrifice your future for it." David looked at her, his expression unwavering. "When I applied to be your clerk, I wrote in my essay that I wanted to learn from someone who believed justice was a verb, not a noun. I'm not going anywhere." Judge. His loyalty was a small, bright light in the encroaching darkness. Maria faced her own battle. The Inquirer, her employer for 3 decades, was hit with a massive defamation lawsuit from one of Croft's shell corporations over an unrelated story she had written months prior. The paper's legal department, under pressure from the board, ordered her to drop all speculative investigations. Her work on the Elmwood fire was officially shut down. "They're trying to silence me," Maria told Vanessa over a secure line. "But they've made a tactical error. They've pissed me off." Maria started using her vacation time, continuing her investigation off the books. She met with Vanessa in secret, passing along information on flash drives, her face etched with the grim determination of a warrior who refused to be benched. The pressure was immense. Vanessa felt the walls closing in, the isolation becoming a physical weight. Friends from her social circle stopped calling. Invitations to galas and fundraisers dried up. Croft had successfully painted her as damaged goods. And, in their world, there was no greater sin. It was during this period of intense pressure that Maria unearthed the key. She had spent a week in the city archives, digging through dusty, forgotten boxes of municipal records from the early 90s. "I found it," she said, her voice electric with discovery during a late-night call. "It was misfiled. Deliberately. I think, under urban renewal assessments, instead of fire department records." She sent Vanessa a secure digital file. It was a preliminary report, written by a junior fire marshal named Thomas Riley in the days immediately following the fire. It was filled with technical jargon, but 2 sentences stood out to Vanessa. Initial findings indicate an electrical origin, inconsistent with the single-point ignition of a candle. Evidence of substandard, non-code compliant wiring found in the primary burn zone of the Rodas residence, specifically at the external service connection point. "Substandard wiring," Vanessa breathed. "But our house was old. The wiring was ancient." "Read the addendum," Maria urged. Vanessa scrolled down. The addendum was a work order from the Philadelphia Electric Company, dated just 3 weeks before the fire. It detailed a city-mandated upgrade to the electrical junctions for the entire Sycamore Lane block. The work had been contracted out by the city to a private firm, Keystone Electrical Services. "Keystone Electrical," Vanessa said the name aloud. It rang a faint bell. Croft tried to buy them 5 years ago. Maria supplied instantly. The deal fell through. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is, Who was on the city council committee that awarded Keystone the contract for that work back in 1993? David, working furiously on his own laptop, found the answer first. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. Councilman Robert Miller. He said. The name hit Vanessa like a physical blow. Robert Miller, a fixture in city politics for decades. A man known for his silver-tongued speeches about civic pride, and Julian Croft's closest, most powerful political ally. The man who was currently chairing the City Planning Commission, the very commission that was scheduled to give the final, televised approval for Croft's crowning achievement, the massive, multi-billion-dollar downtown redevelopment known as the Phoenix Project, in 2 days. Miller was a junior councilman back then, representing the Elmwood district. Maria's voice crackled over the phone. He pushed hard for Keystone to get that contract, even though they were the lowest bidder with a questionable safety record. The pieces fell into place with a sickening finality. The fire wasn't an accident. It wasn't arson committed by her father. It was corporate negligence, a cut-rate contractor using faulty materials, a job rubber-stamped by a corrupt local politician. A politician who was now about to hand Julian Croft the keys to the city. He's been allied with Croft for 30 years. Vanessa realized aloud. Miller helped create the tragedy that Croft has used to fuel his entire life. And now, he's about to profit from Croft's success. Julian didn't know. His entire world, his righteous crusade of revenge, was built on a lie fabricated by the very man who was now his closest partner. The revelation was staggering. It changed everything. It gave Vanessa not just a shield, but a sword, and she knew exactly where and when she would use it. David, she said, her voice calm and sharp with a newfound purpose. Check the agenda for the Phoenix Project hearing. Find the section for public comment. I need you to sign me up to speak. She was no longer a suspended judge. She was a private citizen with a story to tell, and she was about to step onto the biggest stage in the city. The city council chamber was a theater of power, all polished wood, gold leaf, and hushed, self-important gravity. Tonight, it was standing room only. The final approval hearing for Julian Croft's Phoenix Project was the biggest political event of the year, and the city's media had turned out in force. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights glowing like malevolent eyes. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat the city council, with Councilman Robert Miller presiding as Planning Commission chair, his face a mask of civic solemnity. In the front row, Julian Croft sat like a king holding court. He was impeccably dressed, his silver hair catching the light. He projected an aura of absolute confidence, smiling and nodding to his team of lawyers and architects. This was his coronation. The moment his 30-year ascent would be capped with the ultimate prize, a legacy etched in the city's skyline. Vanessa slipped into a seat in the back, unnoticed. She wore a simple gray suit, the attire of a private citizen, a ghost from a life they all thought was over. She carried a single manila folder. In it was a copy of Fire Marshal Riley's suppressed report, the Keystone electrical contract, and the minutes from Councilman Miller's 1993 committee meeting. David sat beside her, a reassuringly solid presence. Maria was in the press section, her pen poised. The hearing began, a tedious parade of fawning speeches. City officials praised Croft's vision and commitment to Philadelphia's future. Croft's architects presented dazzling renderings of the Phoenix Project, all gleaming towers and manicured green spaces. It was a perfectly choreographed performance of progress. Finally, Councilman Miller, his voice smooth and practiced, announced, "We will now open the floor for a brief period of public comment." He glanced at a list. First up, we have Vanessa Rhodes. A murmur went through the chamber. Heads turned. Julian Croft's serene smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes found her in the back of the room, and a look of cold fury, quickly suppressed, flashed across his face. He had not anticipated this. He had stripped her of her power, her position. What could she possibly do here? As a nobody. Vanessa walked calmly to the public lectern, the folder in her hand. The cameras swung toward her, their lenses zooming in. She was no longer a ghost. She was the center of attention. She adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate, and looked not at the council, but directly at Julian Croft. "Good evening, Councilman Miller, members of the council," she began, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the chamber and across the city's airwaves. "My name is Vanessa Rodas. I am a lifelong resident of this city. I grew up in the Elmwood district, a neighborhood that many of you may have forgotten, but which Mr. Croft and Councilman Miller remember very well." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Croft's face was a stony mask. "We are here tonight to celebrate the Phoenix Project, a name that evokes rebirth from the ashes." Vanessa continued, "It's a powerful metaphor, and I want to talk about ashes, specifically, the ashes of a fire that occurred in the Elmwood district in 1993, a fire that cleared the way for Mr. Croft's very first real estate project." The room was utterly silent now. This was not the expected commentary on zoning variances or tax abatements. "For 30 years, Vanessa said, her gaze locked on Julian. "A story has been told about that fire. A story of a tragic accident, of a youthful indiscretion, a story of blame. It is a powerful story. It has shaped lives. It has fueled ambitions. But tonight, I am here to tell a different story. The true story." She opened the folder. "This is a preliminary report from the Philadelphia Fire Marshal's office, dated 3 days after the fire. It was buried in the city archives for 30 years. It concludes the fire was not caused by a candle, but by faulty, non-code compliant electrical wiring installed at my family's home just weeks earlier." She held up the second document. "And this is the contract, awarded by a city council subcommittee, for that electrical work. The contractor was a company called Keystone Electrical, known for cutting corners. And the councilman who chaired that committee, who pushed through their lowball bid despite safety concerns raised by his colleagues, was a young, ambitious politician named Robert Miller." A collective gasp went through the chamber. Miller had gone pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He gripped the edge of the dais, his knuckles white. Croft stared at Miller, a look of dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. The foundation of his entire life, the righteous fury that had driven him, was cracking beneath him. Vanessa wasn't finished. She looked back at Julian, and, for the first time, her voice held not steel, but a sliver of something akin to pity. "You have spent 3 decades, Julian, consumed by a story of blame directed at my father. You built an empire fueled by a desire for revenge against the wrong family. The man you should have been angry with wasn't Daniel Rhodes. He has been sitting beside you, profiting from your pain, for 30 years. It was the secondary twist, the one that broke not just the project, but the man himself. The revelation that his life's great vendetta was a lie. A tragic misdirection shattered him. He looked from Vanessa's unyielding face to Miller's panicked one. The cameras captured it, all: the mogul's crumbling facade, the councilman's mute terror. Julian Croft rose slowly to his feet. He didn't speak. He simply stared at Robert Miller, his expression one of such profound, bottomless betrayal that it was more damning than any shouted accusation. The chamber erupted. Reporters were on their feet, shouting questions. Council members were looking at Miller, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning political calculation. In the chaos, Vanessa Rodas placed her documents neatly back in their folder, turned from the lectern, and walked out of the chamber. She had not raised her voice. She had not issued a single threat. She had simply presented the truth. And the truth, she knew, was its own form of fire. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Councilman Miller, besieged by reporters, was escorted from City Hall by police for his own protection and was in custody for questioning by morning. The Phoenix Project was suspended indefinitely, its financing collapsing within hours as investors scrambled to distance themselves from the mushrooming scandal. Julian Croft's empire, built on a foundation of misdirected rage, began to crumble under the weight of a dozen new investigations. The city was in an uproar. Vanessa watched none of it, as the news channels replayed the dramatic footage from the hearing on a loop. She walked away from the chaos. She ignored the frantic calls from reporters, colleagues, even from Chief Judge Harding. She went home, turned off her phone, and for the first time in 30 years, she slept without the dream of the fire. A week later, a letter arrived by courier. It was from Julian Croft, handwritten on simple stationery, the bold, confident signature she'd seen on countless documents now shaky and uncertain. He asked if she would meet him. Not for an apology, he wrote, but for an explanation. They met in a neutral space, a quiet, empty park on a gray afternoon. He looked 10 years older. The charisma was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. He was no longer a titan, just a man undone by his own history. My sister, Sarah, she was everything. He began, his voice raspy, his gaze fixed on the fallen leaves at his feet. She was bright and funny. She was supposed to have a life. He recounted the night of the fire from his perspective, the chaos, the heat, the horror of realizing Sarah was trapped inside their home. He explained how, in the fog of his grief, his anger had needed a target. Daniel Rhodes, the man who was fighting his family's first chance at real wealth, became that target. The hatred became his fuel. The quest for revenge, his life's purpose. My entire world was built on that hatred, he said, finally looking at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, empty clarity. And it was all a lie. Miller used my grief, my family's tragedy, to hide his own corruption. Vanessa listened without speaking. When he was finished, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It showed a neighborhood block party from the summer before the fire. In it, her father, Daniel, was laughing, his arm around a young smiling girl with a familiar set of stormy gray eyes. That's my father with Sarah, Vanessa said quietly. She used to come over for lemonade after school. He adored her. He would have gone into that fire himself to save her, if he could have. Julian stared at the photograph, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a lifetime of poison finally being drawn out. The following week, the Judicial Conduct Board issued a formal letter. All charges against her were dismissed. They offered her immediate reinstatement to the bench, complete with a public statement of apology for the ordeal she had been put through. She held the letter in her hands, the offer of a return to the life she had built, the power she had wielded, the robe, the gavel, the sanctuary of her chambers. It was all hers again for the taking. Months later, the autumn air was crisp and clean. Vanessa stood on a patch of empty land, a grassy lot where a house had once stood, the lot where she had grown up, on a street that no longer existed. The scars of the past were gone, replaced by the quiet promise of new growth. She was not alone. David Chen was at her side, his loyalty having been rewarded with a new, profound sense of purpose. Maria Flores was there too, a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the Miller scandal gleaming in her future. And standing a respectful distance away was Julian Croft. He had avoided prison by cooperating fully with the Justice Department, his testimony gutting the network of civic corruption Miller had built over 3 decades. He had lost his company, his wealth, his place in society. But in losing everything, he seemed to have found a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. Vanessa unrolled a set of architectural plans on a portable drafting table. The wind caught the paper, and David and Julian stepped forward to hold it down. The title block was printed in clean, simple letters, the Sarah and Daniel Rhodes Foundation for Civic Justice. The city seized all of Miller's assets, Vanessa explained, her voice carrying on the wind. And Julian has channeled what was left of his personal funds into the endowment. She looked at Croft, a quiet understanding passing between them. Their families had been connected by a tragedy born of corruption. Now, they would be connected by a legacy dedicated to fighting it. The plans showed a sleek, modern building, a pro bono legal center, an investigative journalism hub, a community meeting space. It was a machine designed to give ordinary people the tools to hold the powerful accountable. Vanessa looked up from the plans, her gaze sweeping over the empty lot. But she wasn't seeing the ghosts of the past. She was seeing the future. She had been offered her old power back, the power of the robe and the bench. But she had discovered a new kind of power, a power that didn't come from an institution, but from within. It was the power to take the ashes of an old tragedy and build something new, something that would last. It was the power to create justice, not just interpret it. She was no longer Judge Rhodes, adjudicator of what was. She was Vanessa Rhodes, architect of what could be.